Smoke dreams from smoke rings while a cigarette burns. I keep yearning for you.
Welcome to Cigar Cuts, a periodic podcast hosted by Keith and Jeff. Now that I got my radio voice out of the way, let's go to a conversation. So, Keith, it's great to be in the studio with you today. It's our first day here.
Yeah, I'm kind of excited myself. I'm not really sure what to expect. As you're going to find out about us, we don't have much experience in this. We're just a bunch of guys that enjoy smoking cigars, and we want to talk about it. So let's give a shout out though to our producer Bulldog and the Cedarburg Public Library for giving us this platform on which to share our experiences with you.
It's a great opportunity to do an audio podcast, and I think we're going to plan on turning this into a series, aren't we? Hopefully it goes well.
That's the plan.
Hopefully it goes well. So, Keith, when you first mentioned the idea of a cigar show, you told me about it, and I was all excited. I was like all in because this is kind of one of my dreams is to do something like this, and I thought it was a great opportunity. So tell us about the story. What's the genesis of this Cigar Cuts podcast? How did that come about?
Yeah. Well, so I've been working actually at the Cedarburg Public Library for about 3 months now, and it was probably 2 weeks after I started, and I found out that there is actually a radio show or radio series of programs hosted by the Cedarburg Public Library. So this was probably in my subconscious at the time, and I actually had a dream.
You had a dream?
I had a dream that I was in the studio. I've never been in a radio studio before in my life. And our producer here and I were in this dream. We were sitting across from each other talking about a new cigar, and it was a back and forth conversation. And eventually we ended up cutting the cigars and firing them up, which, okay.
I don't think that's going to work so well.
No. At that point, you knew it really was a dream. And I came into work the next day, and I told our producer here about that, and he didn't think it was such a strange idea. When I told my wife, she said, "Seriously? Cigars at the library? Like, what are you thinking about?" And so I just kind of brushed it off. Well, okay, Jeff's a very accommodating guy, and he was encouraging me. But then a few weeks later, I was serving my pastor of all people, who is also a cigar smoker, and I was sharing this story with him, and he just looked at me and said, "I would totally listen to a show like that. Why don't you do it?"
That's great. I hope they all do. Yeah.
And then I think it was about a month later, Jeff, you and I were doing a bike ride and enjoying a stick afterwards, and I was telling you about this, and that's when you started getting
I was
all
excited about
all
that.
excited about it, and started doing some brainstorming, and I came in and talked to Bulldog here about actually doing this, and well, here we are.
Isn't that amazing? That's a great story in a dream. So yeah, it's been one of my dreams to do podcasting or radio or something like that, and I'm glad we're here. So let me talk about the vision for what we plan to do. So I think it's fairly straightforward, the vision for this show. I've looked at a bunch of, and I know Keith, you have too, a bunch of the cigar podcasts and online videos. There's a ton of them out there. Some are cigar company channels, and they seek to kind of educate and promote their products. Some are true podcasters where they've got personalities that, they're on air and they look to entertain. They do it weekly, sometimes every few days. These guys just kind of talk off the cuff, and they wander across a variety of topics, sometimes not even on cigars. It's kind of amazing what
I think we may end up doing that too.
Yeah, you never know. So, and sometimes they'll bring on guests, and in many cases, these guys are sitting in the studio, special studio, smoking, drinking, just having one heck of a fun time. Some of these guys are professionals, and many of them are not. And so You also see single topic videos on very specific things like, cigar smoking 101. So there's hundreds of these different recordings out there. And we, I think, plan to be different, though, right? And so the way we'll be different is we're just two recently retired guys with no radio or casting experience from the Midwest, recording in a public library setting, in a studio to try something new and maybe enlighten our community and the world about cigars and our cigar experiences. How's that sound? So we plan to try to behave on the air. Some of these other guys don't, and that's kind of interesting, as best we can. So we hope to pass on what we've experienced, and we're by no means experts, and maybe we'll provide another voice to a few local businesses, brands, other people who are interested in talking about cigars. We're not experts and don't profess to be, but maybe we'll bring some on that are. We don't have any agenda, right? We're just here to have fun, be able to say that we did have fun and so forth. So I'm kind of an opportunist, and so sometimes I do things for the sake of having a story to tell, and this is certainly one of those opportunities to really be able to talk about this experience. So, but I think most importantly, we just plan to be ourselves, right? That's really what we're looking to do.
Well, since we expect to do a series of these podcasts, we thought it would be a good idea for our audience to get to know us a little bit. It's like, who are these two guys talking? Jeff mentioned a few things already, but let me give you a brief bio of myself. My name's Keith, and as Jeff mentioned, I'm recently retired. My education is in engineering, although I've spent very little of my professional career actually designing things. Most of the time I was in sales and marketing. And a good portion of my career I worked at a single company in the Midwest. And so I'm married. I have two adult sons and two grandchildren, and I've got kind of an eclectic tastes or eclectic group of hobbies. Cigars are one of them, bicycling, running, genealogy, and historical games. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when how that relates to cigars. But that's kind of my background, and I'm interested in, as Jeff mentioned earlier on, just kind of sharing some of my experiences around cigars. So, Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Like Keith, I'm an engineer by education, and did product development engineering for a while. Recently retired, just like Keith, and spent most of my career in a wide variety of leadership roles at work. But what I find is that retirement provides me the time to do things that I've always wanted to do, but it never fit into my schedule. I mean, it was hard to prioritize the things I can now prioritize when you have all the other obligations. So doing this podcast, more roads, bicycling are good examples. Keith and I do ride together occasionally. I also joined my wife's business this year. And that was actually her idea a couple of years ago. She said, I finally figured out what you're going to do when you retire. You're going to come work for me. And I laughed.
She's going to figure out for you.
Yeah, exactly. So actually I did. And that helps her have, a little bit more time so she can, reduce her workload and we can spend more time together and do other things. But she still is the boss, of course, so it's fun. But in 2022, both my daughter and son got married. So we had a hectic time then. She lives out in California, and he's in Colorado, and they're both great places to visit, and we enjoy doing so. And ironically, Keith has a son in Colorado as well, which so we'll have to figure out how we collaborate, to do a trip out there. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me. So, Keith, I'm just wondering, how did you get started smoking cigars?
Yeah. Well, outside of most people's first experience, which would be Swisher Sweets in high school, we'll pass over that phase. But this goes back, probably 25 years ago or so. I mentioned one of my hobbies is historical board games, and I get together with a bunch of guys every week, have for almost 40 years now. And at the time, a lot of those guys were cigar smokers, and we'd get together in somebody's basement and they'd be smoking cigarettes. They were cigarette smokers. They'd be all smoking cigarettes, and I'd come home stinking like cigarettes, and breathing in all this. And I just thought, well, if there's going to be smoke on me, I'd rather have it be something that I enjoy. And it was almost as a defense mechanism that I started smoking cigars, and I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I went to Walgreens or something and bought something a little better than Swisher Sweets, maybe the Dutch Masters or something like that. But I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And it wasn't until about 20 years ago that I met up with a bunch of guys from work, and we're going to end up talking a lot about that shared experience. And there were a bunch of other guys that were kind of in the same boat as me, maybe some with more experience in cigar smokings. And we started getting together on a regular basis, and I started learning from them about other types of cigars, what's good, what's not good, how to cut, how to puff, not to inhale, things like that. So that's kind of how I got started.
Change your clothes before you go in the house and give your wife a hug. Yeah, all those fun things, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
How about you, Jeff?
Well, yeah. So like many other people that smoke cigars, I got started really having a cigar at like events, like family, picnics and parties, fraternity initiations back when I was in college, bachelor parties, weddings. Sometimes we go outside, at a wedding where the father, the groom would have cigars, fishing trips, all those kind of things. But I was never really serious. It was just sort of occasional. And but the thing that was interesting was all those things involved family and friends, and it was the camaraderie that made the difference. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of the experience. The cigars we smoked were either cheap or what somebody brought. We had, no idea what was going on, didn't know the difference really. And I remember I went to a tobacco store back for this guy named Lefty's bachelor party to get some cigars, and seeing the look on the owner's face when I asked to buy two of the biggest turds that he had in this counter cabinet, and he just looked at me like, "What's wrong with you?" So because we had no idea at the time. But then back in the 1990s, kind of before the turn of the century, I had this work colleague that got married, and I was traveling that weekend, so I missed his wedding. But the next week I saw him, and he gave me two Arturo Fuente Hemingways, which are outstanding cigars. They were left over from what he had giving out at his wedding. And wow. Yeah, I finally understood the difference that a fine cigar made. I'm like, this is different. This is a lot different than anything I had. So, but that was kind of a point in time. But really, again, it wasn't until our current Brothers of the Leaf, as we call them, the group that Keith and I spent time with, started getting together, that I kind of became an aficionado. So we'll talk a lot more about those guys in probably a future episode. We won't have time today. But, so that's kind of my story. Along those lines, though, Keith, a fine cigar makes a huge difference in the smoking experience, right? So what kind of brands do you like?
Yeah. In fact, I was just talking to a guy earlier this morning about cigars and telling him that we were going to do this show, and like, oh yeah, my dad smokes cigars, and I have a bad experience with them. And this is one thing that I've found out, that most people that don't like cigars, they've had a bad experience, and it almost always stems back to they had a bad cigar.
Yeah.
Right.
It's almost like people that don't like red wine because they drink bad red wine and it gives them a headache, and they don't really realize what good stuff is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And they never got over the hump of having a good cigar and realizing what a pleasant experience it really is. And so, yeah, some of the brands that I've enjoyed over the years are, I would say my initial first favorite brand was Rocky Patel's. Mm-hmm. Decent, solid brand, generally pretty consistent. And I still like an occasional Rocky here and there. Alec Bradley's are one of my go-to brands. Lately, I've enjoyed a couple of the Asylums. So that brand is starting to inch up, and my maybe my top five. Gurkha's used to smoke a lot of Gurkhas, still smoke some. But I have to say, absolutely right now, and probably for at least the last 5 years, my favorite brand is Christoph's.
Yeah, Christoph is almost synonymous with the way it is.
Yeah,
so
yeah. The guys
if you ever bring Keith a cigar, it's a Christoph.
Like
right?
the guys know, I like Christoph. So although there's many good brands, and we'll probably talk more about that moving forward.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting. Those are all great brands. I've had most of those. My first initial kind of favorite brand was this boutique brand called Cusano. And there's a whole story about that that's probably half a podcast that we'll probably tell at a different time. But they sort of faded. And so, but my current two favorites are Alec Bradley and Oliva, those two brands. And the reason is both are very diverse. They've got a broad line of different types of cigars, and the thing is, you can always count on their kind of consistent quality, right? So you never worry about it being bad. There's other brands that once in a while you get a bad one. It's Oliva and Alec Bradley are really solid. Well, first Alec Bradley, so let's talk about that. Ironically, what's in a name? Not to be confused with one of the top industrial automation equipment brands in the world. It's Alec, not Allen. So, but they've got the Prensado, the Black Market, the Tempest. So there's really a different type for any taste, whether it's bold or mild or all the different types. So
we used to smoke the SCRs.
The SCRs, that's right. That was a classic. Yeah, I remember that. That was really good. But really, my top choice is Oliva. Oliva V, Oliva O. They've got a version called the Nub, which is a 4-inch cigar that's designed to burn right down to the nub. We'll probably talk about that at a later episode. But my top favorite is the Melanio or Melanio. Depends on how you really say it. I'm not sure what the proper way is, but I say Melanio, right? So
do you have a reason for that one being one of your favorites?
I do. My daughter's name is Melanie. So matter of fact, they have these little silk strips that they have on the inside, and so she wore that as a sash for her bachelorette party. That's kind of a joke. So yeah, fun stuff. But I've tried many, and I finally realized that with every opportunity, you go with what you like, right? And so, but you want to keep an open mind if you're kind of exposed to, another brand. Try and see. You never know what you're going to find, right? And so that's kind of my philosophy on cigars.
Yeah, and we'll be talking more about that in some upcoming shows. Just the How do you get exposed to different brands and different flavor or different cigars within brands? And we've got some ideas on that.
I think we do.
Yeah. Well, that was pretty good. I think we've introduced our audience to what we intend to do in this series, who we are, some of the things we like, where we've come from, and let's talk about some of the topics that we have envisioned for the future.
That's a great idea, Keith. So one of the things that we touched on a little bit was this Brothers of the Leaf group and so forth. So, a group of guys that we, got to know each other at work, and we all found out sort of by accident that we all enjoyed cigars, and it's expanded and contracted over the years as people kind of came and went, and we'll talk about the dynamics of that and how kind of important that is. So what do you think about that one? I think that's
definitely want to introduce the brothers.
Yeah, and so another thing that we will touch on, and we actually have some interesting stories if we think back of the concept of a herf. And it's a vocabulary word for those that may not have heard of it. It's HERF, look it up. And it's essentially a gathering of people for the purpose of enjoying fine cigars together, whether it's in a formal event or not. And so that's what we sort of do is, we have a herf. And we all know, hey, anybody want to have a herf, right? We even will use mono herf or duo herf. So we know with that simple word what it is. It's almost like code.
Lake herf.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we'll talk more about herfs. We've had some experience in smoking at clubs.
That's right.
Before, so we envision having sharing some of those experiences, and some are humorous, some are enlightening, and so it's just something that has been part of our cigar experience.
Yeah, we've been fortunate that the cigar stores and shops, are still open. We do have one that was in our past that we'll probably talk about that. it was kind of a victim of the regulations and so forth. And so they were a private club, and they had to close up their cigar smoking there. So yeah, and I think another opportunity, if we can do this, and we'll have to ask around, is perhaps bring on some cigar shop owners or reps or others that might be interested in talking about their experience, how they got started, and a little bit about their place. So.
Yeah. There's some great ones, and we might even drop a few stories about some not so great ones. We'll leave names out of those.
That's right.
Another topic that we'd like to talk about is there's different cigars for different events or different experiences. So the kind of cigar that you might have walking the dog or out on the golf course or out fishing would be different than if you're sitting around with the guys or sitting in a cigar emporium and enjoying a fine cigar and maybe an adult beverage. So
absolutely,
we're going to talk about some of those.
Yeah, the nub was invented for short term, so you have a half hour. That's if you don't have a lot of time, you don't want to waste
But you still want a good cigar.
But you still want a good one, right?
Yeah.
So that makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, the other part that's interesting is selection of the right cigar is important, but lighting and cutting the cigar and how you do that is really essential. There's different ways to do that, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. And there's a lot of resources on the web that go into that, and there's no right way. So it depends on your preference, right?
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the mistakes that we've made along the way. And, you're halfway through a cigar and you go, "What the heck happened there?"
Yeah, did I do something wrong?
Yeah. So exactly. We envision a whole show on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
We've been around the world with work and also personally too, and so. It's interesting when you go international, the different types of things that you might experience and run into. So, yeah. I've
could probably do multiple shows on our various different cigar experiences around the world, and not this isn't about, hey, look at us, we've traveled around the world, but as we have, we've taken the opportunity to have cigars, and it's different.
Bring it with you, and who you run into, and what experience you end up deriving from it's kind of important. So that's good. Well, one of the things that we've experienced, some of our friends said, "Hey, what is this Brothers of the Leaf thing? I'm interested in coming," and they're complete newbies, right? So bringing them on is kind of an interesting experience too. So,
yeah. So. Yeah, I'm finding out. Actually, it's just my most recent HERF. Some of it's even generational.
Right.
I'm finding out that guys, I would say guys, especially in their early to mid 20s, are kind of discovering the pleasures of cigar smoking, but they don't have a whole lot to go with. Maybe their dad hasn't smoked, but they know somebody who has. Right, so they can learn from the experienced people like ourselves. So, but you don't want to start them out with something that's going to knock them off their chair.
That's right. So, absolutely. Yep. And I've seen that happen too.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. You don't want to give them bad experience because that might turn them off to that. So, and there's probably lots of other things we can do. I'm sure this will evolve over time. We can talk about famous, cigar smokers over the years and a variety of other subjects, right? So I'm sure some of these will even morph into one episode on just a subtopic here and there. So it's going to be fun. And
I was told by our library director, make sure you weave in books into cigars.
Oh, that's right. Well, there are some great books. I have a couple of books at home that they're coffee table books, cigar, 101 and all.
I have books that smell like cigars.
I bet you do. Well, hey, so let's wrap up today. So once again, thanks for listening to Cigar Cuts, a periodic podcast hosted by Keith and Jeff. So Keith, that was a lot of fun today. So what do you think?
I had a blast.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the after action report when we get together and discuss how did we do, and looking for some feedback too once this goes live. And find out what our audience is interested in. Again, a thank you and shout out to the Cedarburg Public Library and our gracious producer, Bulldog.
Yeah,
and,
all right.
We're looking forward to meeting up with you all again.
Sounds great. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.